Hello, and welcome back to the UAS Magazine podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Piekarski, and I am joined today by Kevin Pomfret, attorney at Williams Mullen. Kevin, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Danielle.
Of course. So let's kick things off by having you tell us about yourself and your experience in the UAS industry.
Sure. So I came to the UAS industry from maybe a little bit different perspective than some. I started out as a satellite imagery analyst with an organization called NPIC, the National Photographic Interpretation Center, before I went to law school. That's the predecessor to what's now known as NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So I started out as an imagery analyst with satellites and went to law school, graduated from law school, and started practicing corporate law and became really interested in the legal policy regulatory issues around the data that's being collected from a variety of sensors and platforms. And as UAS became more common and popular, I started working with a number of companies and organizations that were looking to use UAS to solve, some of the critical problems that they can address, particularly data on drone data collected from sensors placed on drones. So my law firm represented a consortium of a number of companies in the insurance sector that were interested in this, exploring this technology. We helped to set up the Unmanned Systems Association of Virginia as an effort to promote the work that unmanned systems could do in Virginia, and have continued to represent a variety of companies in commercial and government transactions associated with drones, products, and services.
Great, thank you. So what are some of the most important federal laws, regulations, and policies to keep in mind when offering UAS products and or services to the U.S. government? And I'll tack on a follow-up question to that and ask if you can provide any UAS use cases within the U.S. federal government.
Sure. So there's several layers to that first part of the question. I'll try to address them separately. I assume most of the listeners are familiar with the FAA regulations in Part 107 and certificate of waivers and authorizations. So I won't go into detail on that, but there are a number of other regulations, laws that folks of any type who are selling to the U.S. government need to consider. So government contracts are very different than commercial contracts. They are governed by something known as a Federal Acquisition Regulation, which details a number of provisions that govern commercial relationships with the government. Many of these are very different than commercial, so you need to be aware of those. Some of them are somewhat similar, but there are different types of contracts. There are different issues around intellectual property rights. There are different provisions that you need to comply with regarding employment. So there's those set of issues that need to be addressed. A number of the agencies that would be customers of UAS products and services will have their own set of, they're called the DFARs, which are supplements to the FAR. Department of Defense has some, the Department of Interior has some, NOAA has some. So there are additional supplemental regulations that would need to be considered in a transaction. In addition, with respect to UAS in particular, both the Department of Defense has some unique regulations and rules associated with that, and maybe we can talk about some of those specifically in more detail later. The White House has issued some rules coming out with respect to counterintelligence or counter UAS, also regarding security measures, so those need to be taken into account. Similarly, the Department of Interior has come out with regulations around the use of UAS by the agencies within that. Some of the issues to think about at a higher level would be, for instance, security. Cybersecurity, data protection are all important considerations that will need to be considered in any context. If you're going to be a government contractor, you will need to qualify under something called SAM. You need to register there in order to bid for government contracts. So that's another unique aspect, and there are certain representations you need to make in becoming a government contractor under SAM. Also, something that maybe some folks that are listening don't realize, but there is something called a GSA schedule, which is basically a blanket purchase authority for government agencies to procure products and services from commercial vendors. It's a little bit easier, or often a lot easier, than procurement through government contracts per se. But you need to qualify for that. You need to register on the GSA schedule. And the interesting thing is there is a GSA schedule under Schedule 70 that does provide for Earth observation products and services. So for some of the folks listening to this podcast, there may be an opportunity to qualify for that. So that's something that I would consider looking at. And there's a whole process that you need to comply with regarding to getting on a GSA schedule, regarding price, regarding quality of services, regarding how long your company's been in business, that type of thing. And so those are some of the sort of top level ones, but I guess the main point being that a commercial transaction is very different than a government transaction, and you need to go in knowing that and making sure that you're complying with a variety of regulations and laws that would not be applicable in a commercial transaction. So in terms of use cases, there are, as most of the listeners here will know, there are numerous use cases that the government can use products and services from the UAS sector. Homeland security certainly being one, use by the Border Patrol, disaster response, counterterrorism are some of the ways that it can be used in by the Homeland Security Office. The Defense Department, as I'm sure most people know, uses a lot of UAS technologies for a number of applications. Agriculture, the Department of Agriculture can use them for crop monitoring, pest control. Certainly science organizations like NASA and NOAA are interested in some of the data that can be collected from UAS, maybe more efficiently or more quickly or cheaper than using satellites or other collection means. So that's an opportunity. And then public safety, law enforcement as an example, and other public safety agencies can use and are using unmanned systems for various applications. I will tell you, and I work with a lot of companies with technologies that are trying to sell into the U.S. government and understand the value of the use case, and sometimes get frustrated with the fact that the government isn't adopting it as quickly as possible. And there are a number of studies on this topic, but I think it is important to, if you're going to get into this space, to think about it in terms of the long term and being patient. And the government process takes a while and is not the most efficient, but I think some of these technologies are eventually going to have to be adopted by a number of agencies, and I think UAS is certainly one of those.
Absolutely. So you had mentioned a bit about intellectual property rights, and I wanted to circle back to that. Should companies be concerned with their intellectual property rights when they are dealing with the U.S. government as a customer?
So I would imagine that most companies in this sector should be concerned about their intellectual property rights in almost any transaction that they do, whether it be on the commercial side or the government side. On the government side, the answer is yes, it should. Depending on whether it is licensing or selling products or services, hardware or software or data, there are a mix of laws and regulations that need to be considered. Certainly with respect to a world that I'm more familiar with is around data and software. You would look at things like the FAR has language regarding government purpose rights, unlimited rights or restricted rights. And these are defined in the FAR in terms of what rights you're giving to the government. And if it's unlimited rights, as the name suggests, that they get unlimited rights in the technology. If it's government purpose rights, they have certain rights to share with other government agencies. All of these are tied, for the most part, in terms of how the intellectual property was created and who funded it. So if it was funded by government funds, then generally the government agency would get unlimited rights. But if it's funded by private funds, it might get just government purpose rights, which are more limited. And so those are one of the factors to consider when you're selling products and services to the U.S. government. There are also commercial rights where if you have a commercial product or service that you're offering to the U.S. government, you can have them agree to abide by the terms of your commercial license. Now, it's important to note that not all of those provisions can the government agree to. So, for instance, and this is a lot of the boilerplate in many license agreements, but applicable law, the federal government can't agree to abide by the law of the state of Virginia, for instance, or the state of Maryland. It needs to be governed by federal law. And there are other unique aspects associated with that. So when you're looking at doing a transaction with the government, certainly understanding what the rights are. Another unique aspect is the way that government intellectual property rights works is you need to mark all your intellectual property and make it clear what rights you're giving to the U.S. government so that there's no uncertainty, and that's a very important provision. Another provision or another aspect to think about is depending on some of the funding opportunities, there are programs like the SBIR, STTR programs where Congress has decided to give folks who develop products and services under those types of contracts or arrangements to have broader rights in the technology they develop. So that's another aspect to consider. And if you're doing a grant or a CRADA with the U.S. government, there may be other provisions that apply with respect to what intellectual property rights you have. And if you're developing hardware or patentable technology, there are other provisions that apply there in terms of what right the government could have, particularly if you don't patent it. This is a broad subject, and we can spend several hours talking about it. So I can't go into the detail that it needs, but I think it highlights that yes, it is a complex area. It's different than the commercial transaction. You do want to make sure you do it correctly, or otherwise the government will end up getting unlimited rights, or you may lose your right or ability to patent the technology if that's what you're hoping to do. And so you want to be careful. Now, the government is obviously a good paying customer, so I'm not suggesting that you don't work with them, but you do need to be mindful if you're trying to protect certain intellectual property that you understand what you're agreeing to in the contract.
Great answer. So to flip the table a bit, what are the security concerns for the U.S. federal government when procuring UAS products and services?
So I think there are several. I think one is cybersecurity. I think there is a growing awareness within the U.S. government that a number of technologies and platforms are subject to cybersecurity risks, particularly when they're collecting data, and if that's personal data or sensitive data, even if it's not classified. If it's unclassified but still confidential information, it would be important to protect that. So the NIST, which is a standards organization, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a government agency, has developed some guidance around cybersecurity in general. It's not required by law, but it's best practices that a number of technology sectors have adopted, and it's updated on a fairly regular basis. So that's one aspect of cybersecurity. There's also, I mentioned the Federal Acquisition Reg. There's some section in there that covers cybersecurity. It's basically requires, if it's included in a contract, and this is, I go back to the initial section about the difference between government contract and commercial contract, there may simply be a reference to this far in your government contract, and you need to go take a look at it and see, okay, what does it require? In this particular one, 204-21 would require that you must implement basic security measures to protect the information from unauthorized access or use of disclosure. So this is one aspect of what you need to think about if you're complying with if you're going to bid on a government contract and comply with those requirements. The Department of Defense has, as you can imagine, its own requirements under the DFARS. These cybersecurity requirements are much greater than we would have if you're dealing with classified information. It's much greater than you would have in an unclassified environment. It specifically references the NIST. And so that's something, if you're working with your Department of Defense customers or other customers that are using the DFARS, you need to think about that as well. Certainly the folks here from a security standpoint are familiar with the FAA rulemaking and process regarding remote identification. So I don't think I need to go into that. I'm sure that most folks here are also familiar with the concerns that the Department of Defense and increasingly the government as a whole has with the use of UAS from Chinese manufacturers, and not just Chinese, but certainly manufacturers of UAS from countries that are U.S. considers to be a threat or an area of concern. And so you need to be mindful about which systems you're going to be using on a particular contract, because agencies will be looking at that and making sure that you're complying with the most recent guidance that's come out of the White House or the Department of Defense in terms of you're not using technologies or systems that are on any list that for export compliance or otherwise because of the national security concerns. So those are some of the the main ones to think about. There's specific examples of export compliance that you may want to think about depending on what technology you're using and how you're using it, but I don't think that's necessary to discuss on this podcast.
All right. So how do the Buy American Act and similar regulations impact the sale of UAS products and services to the U.S. government?
That's a good question. The Buy American Act, and there are other acts as well, are laws that are intended to increase economic competitiveness and jobs and basically the economy in the United States. And there are requirements in terms of how much U.S.-made products or U.S.-made components are in certain products if they're going to be procured by a U.S. government agency. And there are exceptions, but if they're goods and materials that are available domestically and can be produced at a fair and reasonable price, then there's a preference to make sure that U.S. companies can compete. Now, it's not a prohibition. This isn't sort of like export compliance where you can't bid if you're from a foreign company, but there are requirements that in terms of pricing, and if you're not a U.S. company, that you have to include in your bid, and there are certain statements that you have to, again, going back to the FAR, there are certain requirements that you need to make or certain statements you need to make in your contract in terms of how much of the goods and materials in your product or service are U.S. based. There are some exceptions to there. There are both exceptions on the government side in terms of certain agencies or for certain procurements don't have to follow things like the Buy American Act. And there are certain countries where the United States has entered into treaties which essentially says that that sales from these countries are not subject to, or sales from companies from these countries are not subject to the Buy American Act. So there's a multi-layered process. It's important to understand, but because of some competitiveness, because of some recent legislation, and frankly, some executive orders coming into the White House, more and more government agencies are looking at during the procurement process in terms of how much of this product and service is from goods and materials that have been manufactured in the United States. So it is going to be an important component for companies that are doing business and selling UAS products and services to the federal government.
Very interesting. So last question here for you. How can UAS vendors stay informed about upcoming government opportunities and solicitations?
So probably the best way is, I mentioned that in order to be a government contractor, you need to sign to register on SAM. And so the first thing that I would do if you're interested is signing onto that. It's not a heavy lift to do that, but there are if you go to SAM, if you register on SAM, there are opportunities to keep track of RFPs, RFIs, learn about potential contracts through that. So that's one aspect to consider. Many government websites have their own sort of newsletter or other opportunities that you can sign up for, visiting websites to see what contract vehicles they may have. One way it's sort of old school, and maybe it's become less of what people consider, although I think, going to conferences seems to have come back. But the government has been pretty good over the years of promoting what they're trying to do, when they're trying to do it, what contracts they're looking at. So going to events, networking with government people, with government customers, listening to them speak at these conferences, meeting the contract officers or the appropriate folks, I think is a really valuable way to have that conversation. Staying involved in various government trade associations involving government contractors in this particular area would be really valuable as well. So there are a variety of ways. I'm not sure, other than going through the SAM process. I'm not sure that there's a one single way to sort of keep informed. I think it's like any aspect of business, is a lot of different layers and staying on top of things and knowing what's going on in your marketplace.
Great answer. Again, we are joined today by Kevin Pomfret, attorney at Williams Mullen. Thank you again for joining us today, Kevin. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, again, thank you for having me. I guess, as I think back about the answers, I do think that government contracting is a unique area of both business and law. And so if you do decide to get involved, I do recommend that you consider working with a law firm or lawyers that have government contracting experience, because while it can be very beneficial, there are risks associated with it. And so that's one thing. And Williams Mullen is certainly a law firm. I'm based up in Northern Virginia, and we have government contract lawyers that can certainly help with that. So that's one aspect. I do think it's important, and this is just something I advise my clients in the technology field and in all areas, to not fall in love with the technology, but to understand what the business case is and to make sure that they align with the technology and your interest in it. So that's another consideration. There are a number of programs, both set-aside programs and also competitions and grants for smaller businesses. And so for those that are in small businesses, whether it be service disabled veterans or minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses or other businesses, there are unique opportunities, I think, to think about. But you have to be in it for the long haul. This isn't a quick sale process. It's a lot of work, but it's one that if you do it right, there are a lot of opportunities. So I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this.
Yes, thank you again. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you or your company is interested in recording a podcast, please contact UAS Magazine. We hope that you enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to next time. Until then.